The snow came down over Ironwood Crossing the way it always did in the black heart of January, slow and patient and without mercy, filling the ruts in the road and softening the hard edges of the world until the whole town looked like something half forgotten. Adaline Mercer stood at the edge of the trading post porch with her thin cream shawl pulled so tight around her shoulders that her knuckles had gone white, and she watched the snow bury the tracks of the wagon that had brought her here, and she understood that no one was coming back for her. She was 20 years old. She had a battered carpet bag that held one spare dress, a tin comb, and a small water-stained daguerreotype of a mother she could barely remember, and she had nothing else in all the world. Not a coin, not a claim, not a soul who would look for her if she vanished into that white silence forever. Her stepfather, Cyrus Pratt, had brought her down out of the hills in the buckboard that morning, and he had not spoken to her once the whole cold way. She had learned long ago that his silences were the safest part of him, and so she had folded her hands in her lap and made herself small and prayed the way she always prayed, which was without much hope. Cyrus was a gaunt, hard-faced man with greasy gray hair and cold pale eyes, and the drink had hollowed him out years ago and left only the meanness behind. Her mother had married him when Ada was 6, and her mother had died when Ada was 11, and in the 9 winters since, Cyrus had made it plain in 100 small cruelties that Ada was a debt to be settled, and nothing more, a mouth he had never wanted to feed. Now he shouldered through the door of the trading post ahead of her without holding it, and it swung back and caught her on the arm, and she followed him inside because there was nowhere else to go. The trading post was warm and close and smelled of tallow and coffee and wet wool, and there were men gathered near the iron stove the way men gather in winter, and they turned to look at her the way men look at a stranger, and then they went on looking in a way that made her stare down at her boots. Cyrus went straight to the counter where the storekeeper, a bald man named Otis Fenn, stood wiping his hands on his apron. Ada could not hear all of what her stepfather said at first, only the low, urgent rasp of his voice, but she heard Fenn answer plainly enough. "I'm not running a charity, Cyrus. You owe me near $11 on the book already, and your credit's dead as a stone. I can't advance you flour, nor salt, nor a thing else till you square it." "I got no $11, Cyrus said. "You know I got no money, but I got something worth more than flour." And he turned and looked at Ada, and the whole warm room seemed to go cold. She understood then, all at once, the way you understand a step missed in the dark, and something in her chest dropped and kept dropping. He meant to trade her. He had brought her down the mountain to sell her like a heifer for a sack of flour and a little salt to see him through the winter, and he had not even had the decency to tell her, because telling her would have meant she was a person he owed something to, and she had never once been that to him. "Cyrus," said Fenn slowly, and even that hard old storekeeper looked uneasy, "there is your girl." "Step-girl," Cyrus said, "and a grown woman, full 20 years. She can cook and mend and haul water, and she don't eat much, though God knows she's cost me plenty. Any man here wants a wife or a worker, she's a fair bargain for what's owed and a sack of flour on top. Cheaper than a mail-order bride, and she's standing right here where you can see the goods." Some of the men laughed low, and one of them, a young cowhand with a red face, said something under his breath she was glad she couldn't hear, and Ada stood very straight in the middle of the floor with the whole weight of their eyes on her, and felt the hot shame crawl up her neck. She would not cry. She had promised herself somewhere on the mountain that morning that whatever came, she would not cry in front of these men, and she held to it now with everything she had, her chin up and her eyes fixed on the far wall where the harnesses hung, though the room had gone blurred and swimming at the edges. "She's got no meat on her," someone said. "She's plain," said another. "I'll not buy trouble," said the red-faced cowhand. "A woman sold off is a woman with a temper, and a woman with a temper is a woman who'll poison your stew." And they laughed again, and Cyrus's face went darker, and Ada understood that even here, even now, at the very bottom of the world, she was being found wanting. It was then that the big man in the corner set down his cup. She had not marked him when she came in, though she did not know how she had missed him, for he was the largest man in the room by a head. He had been sitting alone on a barrel near the window with his back half to them all, a great broad-shouldered shape in a heavy fur-collared coat, and now he rose, and rising he seemed to fill the whole low room. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with long dark hair pushed back from a weathered brown face, and a full dark beard gone faintly gray at the edges, and there was a pale scar through his left eyebrow, and his eyes when they found her were a deep, quiet gray, the gray of the sky before snow. He did not look at her the way the others had. He looked at her the way a man looks at a horse that has been badly used, with something in it that was almost like anger, though not at her. "How much?" he said. His voice was low and rough, as though he did not use it often. The room went quiet. Cyrus turned, and his greedy eyes ran over the big man's plain coat and worn boots, and clearly found them wanting. But a sale was a sale. "The 11 I owe Fen," Cyrus said quickly, "and a sack of flour, and we'll call it square. $12 all told and cheap." The big man crossed to the counter. He moved slow and deliberate, and the other men gave way before him without seeming to decide to. He reached into his coat and laid money on the worn wood, and it was more than $12. It was a good deal more, and he pushed it across to Fen. "Square his book," he said. "Then give him his sack of flour and a sack of salt and a side of bacon besides, and put it on my account." He did not raise his voice. He did not look at Cyrus at all now, as though the man had ceased to exist the moment the money touched the counter. Fen counted it, and his eyebrows climbed. "That's generous, considering." "It's not for him," the big man said. "It's so the girl's not sold cheap." And at last he turned and looked at Ada full on, and she made herself meet his eyes though her heart was slamming, and he said quieter now, meant only for her, "You don't have to be afraid of me, but you'll have to come with me all the same, for there's nowhere else in 50 miles you can go tonight. That's safe. Do you understand me?" She did not understand him. She understood nothing except that she had been bought, and that the men were laughing at him now for paying so much for so plain a bargain, saying he'd been cheated, saying the big fool had thrown away good coin. But she nodded because there was nothing else to do, and she picked up her carpet bag, and Cyrus was already clutching his sack of flour to his chest, like it was gold, and would not so much as look at her, and she walked out of the warm room into the fallen snow behind a silent stranger who had paid a fortune for her and asked for nothing at all. His wagon waited in the yard, and his horses were good ones, better than the coat he wore, she noticed, a matched pair of big-boned bays with their breath smoking in the cold. He handed her up onto the seat without a word, and then he took off his heavy fur-collared coat, right there in the falling snow, and he laid it around her shoulders over her thin shawl, and the warmth of it and the weight of it nearly undid all her promises about not crying. He climbed up beside her in his shirt sleeves as though the cold were nothing to him, and he took up the reins, and the wagon rolled north out of Ironwood Crossing into the mountains, and Ada did not look back, because there was nothing behind her worth a backward glance. They rode a long while in silence. The trail climbed and narrowed, winding up through towering pines heavy laden with snow, and the light failed slowly around them, going from gray to blue to a deep violet dark. Ada sat rigid on the seat and waited for the cruelty to begin, because in her experience the kindness always came first, and the cruelty always came after, and the kinder the front of a thing, the worse its back. But the man only drove, watching the trail, his big scarred hands easy on the reins, and after a time he reached under the seat without looking and drew out a cloth bundle and set it in her lap. It was bread and cold ham and a wedge of hard yellow cheese. "Eat," he said. "You've the look of someone who hasn't in a while." She had not, in fact, eaten since the day before, and she ate now with as much dignity as she could manage, which was not much, and he did not watch her do it, which was its own kind of mercy. "My name is Amos Riker," he said when she had finished. "I've a place up the valley, a good ways yet. There's people there'll look after you. An old woman named Nettie keeps my house, and there's a boy, and a dog that's more trouble than the boy. You'll have your own room with a lock on the inside of the door, and you may use that lock any night you please, and no one will trouble you. Do you hear me? No one." He was quiet a moment. "I know what you think this is. I've seen the look before. You think you've been sold from one bad hand to a worse. But I'll not lay a finger on you, girl, not now nor ever, unless the day comes you'd want me to, and I don't reckon on that day, and it changes nothing if it never comes. You're safe now. I know you've no cause yet to believe that. Time will have to do the believing for you." And Ada, who had been called a debt and a burden and a fair bargain and a plain thing all in one afternoon, sat in the dark of the mountain with the stranger's warm coat around her shoulders and found she could not answer him at all. The valley, when they came to it at last, took her breath away. They crested a high saddle in the trail near full dark, and below them the land opened out into a great sheltered bowl ringed round with white peaks, and it was full of light. Not one light, but many. Warm, amber squares of window glow scattered across the snow, and the long, low shape of a great timber ranch house, with smoke rising from 3 stone chimneys, and a barn near as big as a church, and split-rail fences running out under the snow, and in the pastures below she could see the dark shapes of cattle, hundreds of them, and horses, and the whole valley lay there gleaming in the last blue light, like something out of a story her mother might have told her once, long ago, before the world got hard. She had thought she was being taken to a hovel. She had thought it best some cold trapper's shack where she would freeze and slave until she died. She turned to stare at the man beside her. This man in his shirt sleeves who had let her think he was poor, who had stood in a trading post letting men laugh at him for a fool. "You said," she began, and could not finish. "I said nothing," Amos answered, and there was the faintest thing at the corner of his mouth that might, in a warmer man, have been a smile. "You'll find I mostly don't. The valley's mine, near 10,000 acres of it, and the herds and the timber up the high draws. My father took it up before the war, and I've built it since. The plain coat's my own choosing. A man learns things about people by what they'll say to him when they think he's got nothing. I learned all I needed to know about your stepfather in about a minute and a half." He clucked to the horses, and they started down toward the light. "And I learned something about you, too, standing there with your chin up while they picked you apart. You didn't beg, not once. I've known grown men beg for less." Nettie met them at the door with a lantern, a stout, silver-haired woman with a face made for scolding and eyes made for kindness, and she took one look at Ada, thin and frozen and swallowed up in a man's enormous coat, and she said not a word about any of it. She only clucked and drew the girl inside into a great, warm room, where a fire the size of a small barn roared in a stone hearth, and there were fur rugs on the plank floor, and the good smell of stew on the iron stove, and a shaggy, gray and white dog came skidding across the boards to inspect her, and a small, sandy-haired boy peered around the corner of the kitchen door with wide blue eyes, and then vanished, shy as a deer. "That's Bess, and she's got no manners," Nettie said of the dog, "and that shy article is Toby, and he'll come round when he's decided about you and not a minute before. Now, you'll be froze half to death and starve the other half, and there's nothing in this world a hot supper and a warm bed won't start to mend. So you'll have both, and we'll talk of the rest tomorrow." And she steered Ada toward the fire with a firm, warm hand between her shoulder blades, and Ada, who had braced all day for a blow that never came, felt something crack open very quietly in her chest. And this time, when the tears came, she could not stop them, and Nettie only wrapped her in a quilt and let her weep by the fire and asked her nothing at all. That was the first night. There were many nights after. Ada waited a long time for the truth of the place to show itself, for the warmth to curdle, for the price of all this to come due. She kept her carpet bag packed under the bed in the small, clean room they gave her, the room with the good lock on the inside of the door, and she slept the first week with her boots on. But the price never came due. Amos Riker rose before light and worked till full dark like the poorest hand on the place, mending fence in the bitter cold, breaking ice on the stock tanks, hauling feed to the cattle through drifts up to his thighs, and he came in at night, bone-tired, and ate his supper and spoke maybe 10 words and went to his bed, and he never once came near her door. He asked nothing of her. When she began, out of the deep need to earn her keep that had been beaten into her, to help Nettie with the wash and the bread and the endless mending, no one told her she must, and no one told her she mustn't, and slowly she understood that the work was hers to give and not theirs to take, and that was a thing so new to her she hardly had words for it. The boy came round first, as the boy always does. Toby was an orphan. Amos had taken off a wagon train 2 winters back when the fever went through it and left the child with no one. And he had the careful, watchful quiet of a child who has learned the world is not to be trusted. And Ada knew that quiet from the inside, and so she did not push at him. She only left a twist of sugar candy on the kitchen windowsill where he'd find it, and she mended the ear of his stuffed rabbit without saying anything about it. And one gray afternoon he came and stood at her elbow while she kneaded bread and watched her a long while and finally said, "Nettie says you're going to stay." And Ada's hands went still in the dough, and she said carefully that she supposed she was, if she was wanted, and Toby considered this with great seriousness and then said, "I want you to," and went back to his corner as though nothing had happened, and Ada had to turn her face to the window for a moment so the boy wouldn't see it. The dog was easier. The dog had decided about her the first night. And Amos, the silent man, the man who had bought her and set her free in the same breath, she came to know him slowly, in pieces, the way you come to know a mountain. She learned that his silence was not the meanness of Cyrus's silence, but the quiet of a man who had lost the habit of speech. She learned it from Nettie, in the low voice of an old woman telling a hard thing by firelight, one night when Amos was out in a storm bringing in a strayed heifer. That Amos Riker had had a wife once, a young wife named Clara, and a child coming, and that a winter fever 8 years gone had taken them both in the same black week, the wife and the babe unborn, and that Amos had gone up into the high timber alone after and not come down for the better part of a year, and had come down at last a silent man who worked and did not weep and did not smile and did not live so much as endure. "He's been alone in this big warm house 8 years," Nettie said, "surrounded by everything a man could want and nothing he can hold. And then he goes down to the crossing for salt one January day and sees a slip of a girl being sold off a porch, and pays a fortune for her, and brings her home, and I'll not say a word about what I hope, because hope's a dangerous thing at my age. But I'll tell you this, child. He took his coat off in the snow for you. I've kept that man's house 8 years, and I never once saw him take his coat off for the cold, let alone give it away. So." And she had gone back to her knitting and said no more. Ada lay awake a long time that night, and for the first time she did not sleep with her boots on. The winter deepened, and then, by inches, began to loosen its grip, and Ada found that without ever quite deciding to, she had made a place for herself in the warm heart of that valley. She could make Toby laugh now, a rare and marvelous sound. She could sit across the supper table from Amos Riker and pass him the bread and feel his quiet gray eyes rest on her a moment and not be afraid. She had begun, in the long blue evenings, to read to the boy from the one book of stories Nettie owned, and she would look up sometimes and find Amos in his chair by the fire. Not reading, not working, only listening to the sound of her voice, with something in his weathered face that made her lose her place on the page. Once, carrying wood, she slipped on the ice by the barn, and he was there before she knew it, his big hands catching her, and for a moment they stood close in the cold, bright air with the whole white valley around them, and neither one of them moved. And then he set her carefully on her feet and stepped back and touched his hat brim and went on to his work. And Ada stood, holding her scattered firewood, and felt her heart going like a hammer, and understood that something had changed in her that she did not know how to change back. She might have gone on that way a long while, learning to be happy so slowly she'd never have caught herself at it, if Cyrus Pratt had not come back. He came on a raw gray afternoon in the failing end of winter, and he did not come alone. Word travels in the mountains the way water travels, finding every low channel, and the word had reached Cyrus at last of what he'd done, that the silent fool he'd sold his step-girl to for a sack of flour was Amos Riker of Elkhorn Valley, the richest man in 3 counties, 10,000 acres and 1,000 head, and money in a bank in Denver. And Cyrus Pratt, who had traded a girl for $12 of credit, had been eating himself alive over it ever since, and he had come up the mountain with a lawyer's clerk from the crossing and a paper and a grievance and a scheme, to take back what he had thrown away, or to be paid a king's ransom to leave it be. Ada saw them from the kitchen window, the 2 of them on their thin horses coming down the valley trail, and she knew her stepfather's gaunt shape at half a mile, and the old cold dread closed over her so fast and so complete that she had to grip the edge of the wash basin to stay on her feet. She was still that girl underneath. She would always be that girl a little, the one who could be sold. Nettie found her white and shaken and got the whole of it out of her in a moment. And then Nettie's kind face went hard as flint, and she said, "You'll stay right here, and you'll not go out that door, and you'll leave this to Amos." And she went to find him. Amos came in from the branding pens with the day's dirt still on him, and he listened to Nettie without a word. And then he looked across the room at Ada standing frozen by the window, and whatever he saw in her face seemed to settle something in him. He did not rage. He did not reach for the rifle over the door. He only said, "Come stand by me, if you're able, but you don't have to. Not for anything in this world do you have to. This is his shame, not yours, and I'd not have you carry it." And Ada, who had spent 9 years learning to make herself small and invisible when trouble came, found that she did not want to be small anymore. She wiped her hands on her apron and she lifted her chin the way she had lifted it in the trading post, and she went and stood beside Amos Riker in the open door of that great warm house as the two riders came into the yard. Cyrus climbed down, grinning his rotten grin, all false warmth now that he smelled money. "There she is," he said. "There's my girl. Ada, honey, you're looking well. Real well." He had never once in his life called her honey. "Now, Mr. Riker, sir, I think there's been a misunderstanding, and I've brought Mr. Coldwell here to help us set it right. See, that arrangement we made down to the crossing, that wasn't a proper sale, on account of a man can't rightly sell what he don't own, and I never signed no papers giving up my guardianship. So, by law, the girl's still mine to keep or to give, and I've reconsidered giving her, unless, of course, a fair consideration could be reached between gentlemen." "How much?" said Amos. It was the same thing he had said in the trading post, in the same low voice, and Ada saw her stepfather's greedy eyes light up, saw him think he'd won, saw him open his mouth to name some enormous ransom. But Amos went on before he could speak, and his voice was very quiet and very level, and it stopped Cyrus's mouth like a hand. "How much," Amos said, "do you reckon she's worth? You. Because you named her price once already in front of 10 men, and you sold her for $11 of your own bar tab and a sack of flour, and every man in that room heard you do it. Fenn heard you. The Callisters heard you. That paper your clerk's holding won't mean a thing against 10 witnesses to a sale you made gladly and took payment for. You didn't sell her cheap because you were forced to it, Pratt. You sold her cheap because to you she was worth cheap. That's the thing you'll not undo. Not with any lawyer's paper. A man doesn't get to sell a thing and then come back and say he never valued it, once he learns what it was worth." He let that stand a moment in the cold air. "You'll get nothing from me. Not $1. What you'll get is this. You'll turn those horses around and you'll ride down out of my valley and you'll never come up it again. And if the word ever reaches me that you've spoken this girl's name in that town or any other, I'll come down and find you and I'll not bring a lawyer. Now go." The clerk was already backing his horse. He had not been paid enough for this. And Cyrus stood a moment in the snow with his mouth working and his scheme in ruins around him, and he looked at Ada, and for one last time all the old meanness came up in his face, and he opened his mouth to say some poisoned thing. "Don't," Ada said. She had not planned to speak, but the word came out of her clear and steady across the yard, and it surprised him into silence, and it surprised her most of all. She stepped forward off the porch, out of the shadow of the doorway, and she stood in the open snow and faced the man who had owned her for 14 years, and she was not afraid, and the not being afraid was the strangest and most wonderful thing she had ever felt. "You sold me for a sack of flour," she said, "and I hope it was good flour, Cyrus. I hope it fed you well through the winter because it's the last thing you'll ever have of mine. You called me a debt my whole life, but I was never yours to spend. I know that now. Somebody had to buy me for $12 and treat me like a queen before I could see it, but I see it now. Go home. There's nothing for you here. There never was." And Cyrus Pratt, who had no answer to that, because there is no answer to the truth, climbed onto his thin horse and turned it and rode up the valley trail and out over the high saddle and out of her life forever. A small, mean shape dwindling against the great white mountains, and Ada stood and watched him go until she could not see him any more, and then she found that Amos had come to stand beside her, close, his shoulder near her shoulder, and neither of them said anything for a while. "You didn't have to do that," he said at last. "I did, though," she said. "I've been letting other people say what I'm worth my whole life. It was time I said it myself." He looked down at her, this silent giant of a man, and the last of the winter light was gold on the snow, and Toby had crept out onto the porch behind them with the dog, and Nettie stood in the warm doorway with her hand pressed to her mouth, and Amos Riker said in that low, rough voice he so rarely used, "I'll ask you something now, and I want you to know before I ask it that your answer changes nothing about the room or the lock or the safety of this place. That's yours no matter what you say, till the end of your days, and I mean that. But I'll ask it all the same, because I've been 8 years a dead man walking, and you've gone and made me alive again, and a live man has to ask." He took a breath. "I'd have you for my wife, Ada Mercer, not bought and not owed and not obliged, chosen. If you'd have a quiet old wreck of a man who doesn't say much but who'll spend everything he's got and everything he is keeping you warm and safe and yours own self free. That's all the kingdom I've got to offer you. It's yours if you want it, and it's yours if you don't." Ada Mercer stood in the golden snow of Elkhorn Valley and looked at the great warm house full of firelight, and the shy boy on the porch, and the fool dog, and the old woman weeping happily in the doorway, and the 10,000 acres going blue and gold in the falling dusk. And last of all, she looked up at the silent man who had taken off his coat for her in a snowstorm before he knew one single thing about her, who had paid a fortune to a scoundrel just so she wouldn't be sold cheap, who had given her a lock for her door and asked for nothing behind it. And she understood at last that the kingdom he was offering her was not the land, and not the herds, and not the money in the Denver bank. The kingdom was this: to be chosen instead of sold, to be worth the whole of a good man's heart instead of the price of a sack of flour, to be safe, to be home. "Amos Riker," she said, and she was crying and laughing both at once, and she did not try to stop either one. "You great silent fool. Yes, of course it's yes. It's been yes for a while now, I think. Only nobody ever asked me anything before, so I didn't know how to say it." And he laughed. Then Amos Riker, who had not laughed in 8 years, a great rusty startled sound that rolled out across the valley and made the horses lift their heads, and Toby whooped on the porch, and the dog began to bark at the joy of it without knowing why, and Nettie sobbed and laughed into her apron, and Amos reached out with one big scarred careful hand and brushed the tears and the snow from Ada's cheek as though she were made of something precious, which he had decided down to the marrow of him she was. They were married in the spring, when the valley threw off its white blanket and came up green and roaring with snowmelt and new grass, under the big cottonwood by the creek, with the whole of the far-flung valley folk come up to see it. The same Callisters and the same storekeeper Fenn, who had stood in that trading post and watched a girl sold for a sack of flour, come now to watch her wed the richest and kindest man in 3 counties, in a dress of pale blue that Nettie had sewn with her own hands. Toby stood up with Amos and lost the ring twice and found it both times. Bess wore a ribbon and ate half the wedding cake. And when the preacher asked was there any who knew a reason these two should not be joined, the whole valley was silent, and into that silence a meadowlark sang, and Ada, who had once been worth a sack of flour, married her mountain man and became the queen of 10,000 acres, and, far more than that, the beloved of a good and gentle heart, which is the only kingdom in this hard world that is ever truly worth the having. And in the years that came after, when there were children of their own tumbling through that warm valley, and Toby had grown tall and stayed on to work the land he loved, and the great house rang with the sound of a family. Ada would sometimes stand at the high saddle in the trail on a winter evening and look down at all the warm scattered lights below, and she would remember the frightened girl who had once stood on a cold porch and watched the snow bury her tracks and been certain no one in all the world would ever come for her. And she would think how strange and merciful the world could be, that the worst day of her life, the day she was sold, had carried her by a road she could never have chosen to the best of all her days. She had been sold for a sack of flour. She had been given, instead, a kingdom. But the kingdom was never the valley. The kingdom was being loved, and that, she had learned, was worth more than all the flour and all the gold and all the 10,000 snowbound acres in the wide white world.